I want to welcome everyone here today to this wonderful room, and I just want to salute that force of nature, Miles Rappaport, for helping put this together.
Very much deserved.
Before I begin, I just want to make sure everyone understands the depth of the potential problem we face. You all are aware of a certain number of elections that happened yesterday with some quite striking results. And one of my favorite responses to this election came in a tweet from Jerry Falwell Jr., which I will just read to you. And Jerry Falwell's tweet went, "D.C. should annex Nova," meaning Northern Virginia, "and return the governance of Virginia to Virginians!" Exclamation points. The founders intended D.C. to include all Fed employees who are conflicted. So when we have people in the country suggesting that we move gerrymandering to existing state lines and alter them, we know that we have a serious problem to discuss and debate. And that's why I'm honored to be here on this, at this wonderful session. I am not going to give long intros because you have all of them, but this is a very, very distinguished and knowledgeable panel. We're going to kick it off with Ruth Greenwood, the Senior Legal Counsel for Voting and Redistricting at the Campaign Legal Center. May God bless them. And she will talk about Gill v. Whitford and its potential impact, and then we will open a discussion on it that will ultimately include all of you. I have a few questions I want to ask, but I want to move to this distinguished audience as quickly as I can. So, Ruth, if you would instruct us on the stakes here, we would all be very grateful. And she can move. I guess you're going to move to...
Hi, I'm Ruth.
Oh, there you are. You're already there. Good.
Hi, the purple back here. Very, very non-partisan purple. Hello, everybody. So I am Ruth, as EJ said. I'm one of the counsel on the Gill v. Whitford case. I met Bill Whitford back in 2014 when he said, "I think we've got a problem with our district system." And I said, "Sure, I agree. What are we going to do about it?" And so, as fate would have it, the wonderful Eric Magee, who is sitting over here in the corner of the room, and one of my other co-counsel, parentheses, also my husband, Nick Stephanopoulos, got together and did this article about how we can measure partisan gerrymandering using a metric that Eric had developed in a political science journal, which was then called the Wasted Votes Differential. And I told him that was bad branding, so we eventually got to the efficiency gap, so you're welcome. Anyway, so this was merely one part of it. So that I'm going to briefly go over the three parts of the test, but then I'm mostly going to focus on what happened at oral argument, because we are in that lovely period where we don't know the decision, and we can all hope that we win. I guess both sides can hope that we win. As with tests for one person, one vote, and other tests under the 14th Amendment, our test has a partisan intent prong. You can't stumble into a gerrymander and then suddenly have your map struck down. You have to intend to advantage your side. One of the reporters around the time of the oral argument at the Supreme Court said, "Wow, it must have been so easy for you. The facts were like crazy in Wisconsin." And I was like, well, it took a lot of time to build that record, but you're right. Once we eventually got it all out, the facts were pretty crazy. And there's no shortage, right? Wisconsin is not unique in that. There are many other states, like North Carolina, where we have just finished a trial on a similar issue. The second step, we think there should be a discriminatory effect. And the question is, how do you measure whether there's a discriminatory effect? We like to say this. We think the standard should be that there's a large and durable gerrymander. I'll go through what the various justices thought about that. But that's the standard, and then you need metrics to measure it. And so the efficiency gap was one metric, and we were able to calculate that going back to 1972, showing what the efficiency gap had been in many of the states over many of the election years, so that we could say not only what is large, as in a historical outlier, but what is durable? What do we tend to see if we see an efficiency gap of X? Does it stay X, or does it go back to zero? And so we had expert witnesses speaking about that. And then the third part of our test is that there's no justification for that discriminatory effect. Again, it's not very fair to say to a state, look at this terrible gerrymander you drew. We don't have an alternative. There's nothing else you could have done, but we're still going to strike down your plan. You know, you need to show that there's some alternative, and I'll go through that. So very quickly, in terms of the evidence from trial, with respect to partisan intent, we had lots of emails in a spreadsheet, some of my favorites. This set of talking points where it said, the maps we pass will determine who's here 10 years from now, which is, you know, music to my eyes when I saw that they were talking about durability and the judges were interested in durability. Another fabulous find was an Excel spreadsheet called Tale of the Tape, which is a boxing term that says we're measuring ourselves off before the big fight. And even better, they had maps called Joe Assertive and Tad Aggressive. I originally thought, oh, that's a tad aggressive. However, Tad was one of the people drawing the plans. So this was some of our evidence on intent. They knew what they wanted to do, and then they knew what they wanted to do. Next step, effect, did they do it? This shows the efficiency gaps from 1972 to 2014. On the right-hand side is Democratic advantage. On the left-hand side is Republican advantage, and you can see Wisconsin is out in the tails of the distribution as one of the worst of all time, beaten only by Virginia, Florida, North Carolina, all maps that attracted court scrutiny in 2012, and then also Michigan, where people have talked about filing a suit. So as of the time of this case, 2014 was the latest year on record, and the Wisconsin plan for 2012 and 14 was one of the worst on record. And then proving our case, looking at there was no justification. We had a professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison present a demonstration plan. He just drew one plan, and he said, look, I can pretty much match the metrics in terms of population deviations, compactness, and municipal splits, but look, I can get a -2% efficiency gap, whereas yours has -12. So we said, hey, it is possible to draw something else. So we went on to, we won, yay. Actually, we won at the motion to dismiss, and then at the summary judgment phase, and then the final judgment. So there's 3 great sets of writings, and I believe they were written by different justices, so they each take a different angle on how to address this issue, which I think is good in that it gives you different things to cite in other courts, potentially bad because it gives the Supreme Court lots of different things they can pull out as the controlling opinion. Anyway, so we go to the Supreme Court. This I got because lots of reporters said to me, do you have a photo of Stephanopoulos and Magee? And I was like, no, I don't. And now I have them banging on the doors of the Supreme Court for justice. And then this is some of our plaintiffs and lawyers at the Supreme Court, because actually Bill Whitford isn't in this. He hadn't arrived in town yet. This shows you Bill Whitford sitting next to Arnold Schwarzenegger, and for that we have Dan Vicuña to thank, who is our connection to the governor, who is obviously very interested in getting partisanship out of districting, and I just thought it was really cool that they got to sit next to each other during the Supreme Court argument. Okay, so what happened at the Supreme Court? The first main issue that arose was standing. And I've given presentations about this since then to high schools and university classes and community groups, and they all say, what's standing? And so many of us in the room are lawyers and know what standing is. The sort of main person, one way it has been encapsulated was by Chief Justice Roberts, who said, if you can't challenging the districting throughout the state, then your claim seems to be that there is no way for you to raise your claim. And to me, this is what the standing question boils down to. If they don't like our theory, you know, intent, effect, no justification, then there's nobody that could bring that claim. They don't like the theory, there's no one to bring that. It's very unlikely that they would say, we love that theory. You can totally assess redistricting plans as to whether they're partisan gerrymanders on a statewide basis. But we don't think you can have an individual like Bill Whitford, who's a Democrat, argue that that's the claim, right? If that claim exists, then a Democrat should be able to say, I'm a Democrat, I'm harmed because of my ability my ability to coordinate and associate and express my speech with everybody else in the state who's a Democrat is being harmed by this districting plan. So I mean, I guess a lot of people have said, oh, they could just, find against you on standing and send it back. The only real way I could see that is if they say, well, you should have had the Democratic Party. They have standing, but no individual Democrat has standing. So I suppose they could do that. We could go back, add the Democratic Party, and go for a judgment again. But I don't think of standing as being hugely overblown because it goes hand in hand with the claim itself. If we lose on the claim, then fine. Whether we win or lose on standing is irrelevant. The next thing that came up was about intent. And so, of course, we know Justice Kennedy cares about everything, but he was very interested in this, and he asked this question. Suppose a state constitution or state statute says all districts shall be designed as closely as possible to conform with traditional principles, but the overriding concern is to have a maximum number of votes for party X or Y. And then he says, what resolved? And there were two people arguing, one for the state legislature and one for the Attorney General's office. And both of those people said, yeah, we think that would violate the Constitution. That would be an intentional discrimination. And there was some back and forth about whether it would be the First or the 14th Amendment, and they eventually said it would be both. And from my perspective, this is essentially what's going on. I mean, you go to those documents, we are drawing plans to determine who will be here 10 years from now. We are doing an aggressive plan to advantage ourselves. It's not the state constitution, but it is the state arm of government that is trying to advantage themselves. And so I hope that if we have, Kennedy on this, then maybe we have him on other things. I'm an optimist, unlike Tom Sines. With respect to effect, we, of course, had wonderful Justice Breyer, and I'm going to go through his one at a time because he likes to speak at length. He said, well, why don't we divide down your effect prong into 3 steps? And I like this. I'm cool with this. If he wants to do 3 steps, bring it on. Is there partisan asymmetry? You can measure that with things like the efficiency gap, the mean median difference, partisan bias. There's a new metric, I think, called the declination, which looks really good. I think these things will develop, and we shouldn't choose just one metric. But is there partisan asymmetry? You can have an expert say yes or no. Number 2, is there going to be persistent asymmetry over a range of votes? So that's important, particularly when we think about Vicuña yesterday. There were people on Twitter saying, well, see, gerrymandering is not such a big deal. You can break the gerrymander. As far as I'm concerned, you can break a majority, but the gerrymander's still there. As someone mentioned, you still needed Democrats to get a huge amount of support in order to get maybe a majority in the House. I mean, it's the same thing with Wisconsin. We had our expert testify that it would take an unprecedented political earthquake for the efficiency gap ever to go back anywhere towards 0, and certainly for the Democrats to win the House back in Wisconsin. So can you look at whether there's a persistent asymmetry? Sure, you can swing the vote. You say, well, we think as they did in Wisconsin, we think in 2012, Republicans will get 48.6% of the vote, and they got 48.6% of the vote. Let's swing the vote 10% in either direction and see how many seats we keep. And then as they went from tad assertive to tad aggressive to Joe aggressive, they reduced the number of competitive seats so that not only would they get their 59 seats, but they would be very, very hard to lose those seats. So you can look at, is there an asymmetry? And then thirdly, and if there is, you say, is this an extreme outlier with respect to asymmetry? And so this is where the historical view comes in. I can actually, a mathematician told me this one time, I can tell you that the number is 4, but you don't know if that is big, because if the scale is minus 1,000 to 5, 4 is really big. If the scale is 1 to 1,000, 4 is really small. So you can't just say the efficiency gap is 12. You have to say, well, what is it everywhere else? What is it usually? What would we expect? And so in Wisconsin, we were able to do that and show that the plan there was a historical outlier. So again, on effect, this would be a great test. Thanks, Justice Breyer. I hope we get it. And then in terms of justification, this is where I think we're going to see a lot of movement in the future cases. I think with intent, people say we win. Things are going to go underground and nobody will email and they'll hide all of their documents. Is there a way that we can use neutral plans, things like Joey Chen and Wendy Tam Cho and other particularly mathematicians and political scientists produce? Can we use simulated plans to get a sense of some sort of a a baseline, you know, what would be fair, and then use that to infer intent. So that may be something that has to develop if we can't find the smoking gun emails, although finding the smoking gun emails is very fun. With respect to justification, though, this is another area where it didn't, it came up and the other side said, look, you know, Democrats are all in Milwaukee and Madison, Republicans are spread out. How could you possibly draw a fair plan? We're like, well, we did. We literally gave you a fair plan in our complaint. Here it is, here are the numbers, look how fair it is. And then Joey Chen produced what I like to call his Joey-grams, where he looked at, you know, what would you get if you simulated plans in Wisconsin and you only followed the criteria as listed in the state constitution, and we can argue about how his algorithm you know, incorporates those, how it could better incorporate those, and those sorts of things. But in this case, basically, the evidence showed Wisconsin is actually kind of a pretty even state when it comes to geography. You have a whole bunch of packed Republicans in Waukesha, and you have a bunch of packed Democrats in Milwaukee, and so you can pack some people in there, and then in the rest of the state, there's blue and red people everywhere, and you can divide them up. It's not hard to draw a fair plan. So the question, I think, that comes up for future cases came from Justice Kagan, who said, would it be fair to require plaintiffs to provide those maps, many, many of them, so that one can actually tell whether the actual map is an outlier? And so I don't presume that the court will say, you must employ Joey Chen, although wouldn't he love that, you know, to do your maps in the future. But I imagine that they may say, look, this was helpful. You know, it was an amicus brief filed. We were able to look at it to see what was fair. And so that may develop as we see future cases. Of course, if we lose, it's a different story. The last thing I wanted to go through was this question of baselines and remedies. This only came up because my boss talked about it. This is Paul Smith, orator extraordinaire. He said, if they come back with a remedy map that matches the sort of neutral geography, even if it's somewhat favourable to the party that's in charge, that should be okay. They don't have to go to zero at the remedy stage. And this must have been music to Chris Jankowski's ears, because here he was telling us, look, you shouldn't have to get zero of something. You should just be within a range. And that's exactly what our test proposes. You know, the experts suggested a plus or minus 7 efficiency gap. We think that that can be worked out in subsequent cases. But this is something where hopefully it's not that we're shooting for some platonic ideal. We're trying to accept the rough and tumble of politics, but just not let it go, so crazy that voters have no voice anymore. Yes. So if we lose, again, from Paul, you're going to have a festival of copycat gerrymandering, the likes of which this country has never seen. So that will be very exciting for Chris and Kelly, who we just saw, because they can gerrymander to their heart's content. I am, as I say, an optimist, and so while they may want to do this, I think the fact that we have all of these tools to shine a light on partisan gerrymanders means that we will be able to do that. Even just in the recent North Carolina redrawing after their Covington map was struck down as a racial gerrymander, we were able to present. In fact, Senator Clark, one of the state senators, made his little Excel spreadsheet, pulled up all the numbers, and determined efficiency gaps, mean median differences, and partisan biases, and then said to his committee, I've determined that this is a gerrymander. Now, this type of data is crucial. You put it to the committee and say, hey, what you're about to do is going to be really unfair to a significant portion of your constituents. Do you still want to proceed? And then, of course, if they proceed, you have this sort of evidence on the record. Hopefully you can spur outrage. We saw again in North Carolina, the Moral Mondays protests. There are ways to harness the people, hopefully, to take power back from the people that they allegedly elect. So hopefully there are ways through ballot initiatives and through grassroots action that even if we lose, we can still use all of the fact of the discussion of gerrymandering and the outsized influence of partisans in redistricting to try to get change for 2020 so it won't be all like it's been until now. And if we win, of course, the first thing is we get to strike down the Wisconsin plan, and Bill Whitford will be very, very happy. And Duchin is up here as well, one of our Wisconsin partners from the beginning. I met him in 2014 as well, as we talked about what to do with this map. So that will be step one. We strike down the map. We then, of course, go into a remedial process and try to work out what is fair. And I think that will be, frankly, as fascinating as the process of trying to work out if you can strike down a gerrymander. So hope we get to do that process. And then, of course, we'll have litigation everywhere across the country. This is just a little snapshot from Justin Levitt's website. I'm sure he will keep updating it to tell you where there is litigation. My hope, though, is that people who really just care about partisanship, they don't care about race, they don't care about dilution based on one person, one vote, they really just care about partisanship. If we give them a vehicle, hopefully they can just use that vehicle we've given them, fight about that, and there's a relatively clear standard, so if they don't have a good argument, they get kicked out of court. And then we can leave race and redistricting to own all of the Voting Rights Act and racial gerrymandering claims. It's not hijacked by partisans. It means that it can actually be about communities of color and what is best for those communities and their ability to elect their candidates of choice. Again, I'm an optimist. So that's the end. Thank you.
I want to thank Ruth for that wonderful presentation. I hope it's as persuasive to Justice Kennedy as it is to me. I also want to say it's great to hear it in an Australian accent. Even though the one downside is gerrymander sounds so much better in an Australian accent, but Australia gave us the Australian ballot, the secret ballot. Australia has what I believe is a wonderful system of compulsory attendance at the polls. Some call it compulsory voting. I call it universal voting. And so may you lead us to the promised land on gerrymandering. And we have a wonderful panel here today. Moon Duchin, to my immediate left, is Associate Professor and Director of the Program in Science, Technology, and Society at Tufts University. Cathy Duvall is the head of the Redistricting Reform Project. David Vicuña, I hope I got that right. Close enough. Close. Try me.
Vicuña.
Vicuña, okay. People have a right to their names being pronounced properly. Is the National Redistricting Manager for Common Cause. Michael Lee is Senior Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. And Wendy Underhill is the Redistricting and Elections Director at the National Conference of State Legislatures. I just want to say we have to protect Wendy today because she is resolutely nonpartisan on this matter, but her head is full of useful information, and we are really happy that you are on this panel. I'm going to start with Moon, if I could. There is a lot of hope, as we heard in Ruth's presentation, banked on the courts to recognize some judicially manageable standard for partisan gerrymandering, perhaps in the form of the efficiency gap. Are there tests or scores that simultaneously do a good job of sort of judging the gerrymandered maps and are also easy to explain to the public and the courts?
Okay, hi. So as you heard, I'm Moon Duchin, and before I go into answering that question, just let me say a word about who I am and where I'm coming from. So I'm a mathematician. I do geometric topology. I'm the token mathematician in the house today. I got interested in this problem through compactness, which is something that you heard about in passing, a traditional districting principle that says that the shapes of districts should be reasonable, but nobody's ever really nailed down what that ought to mean. We have a research group of mathematicians and computer scientists and others who think not only about compactness, but also about analyzing vote systems, about mathematical dimensions of many of the things that have come up today, about computing solutions, and so on. And one little plug, you've heard about the importance of everyone learning to draw maps. Our group, the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering group, we're staging workshops around the country. We just got through with Wisconsin and North Carolina for some reason. And we're going to Texas, and I just want to invite everyone. We have a workshop February 1st to 4th in Texas, where one of the important focuses is to teach everyone who comes how to draw maps. It's free, it's open. Hope to see you there. Okay, so to this question, I think that's a crucial one because you've heard so many competing ideas about fairness today and different ways of operationalizing that. We've heard about proportionality, competitiveness, the right number of safe seats, responsiveness, and so on. And sometimes you tend to hear all of those different norms or goals with just an and, as though you could do all those things effectively and simultaneously. And one of the challenges is to understand some of the trade-offs and turn them into a way to rein in the worst abuses probably by quantifying them and deciding in some way how much is too much. So I loved many of the things that you heard about in the last presentation, and I want to put a little bit of emphasis on one of them that we haven't heard that much about today. If you go to the AAAS stated meeting tonight, I'll be able to talk about this a little more, but that one is sampling. So now we've heard it alluded to a few times that maybe technology, maybe computers can help get us out of this mess that they arguably got us into. And one idea is that you can learn to build giant ensembles of possible maps. Not one demonstration plan, not 200, but big ensembles that show you ways that you can slice up a state while taking into account all of the local features, all of the local laws, and everything that should bear on the problem. I want to make a little plug that I agree with Ruth very much that branding matters. So in the same way that wasted votes differential became efficiency gap, maybe we can all in this room agree not to call them simulated plans because that sounds fake or speculative or unreal, and to call it sampling because that's something that we're comfortable with, I hope, culturally. So the idea then is this magic phrase, outlier analysis, can come to the rescue. Gerrymandering is a fundamentally multi-dimensional problem. There's packing, there's cracking, and in the case of Wisconsin, in 99 different districts. And we're trying to capture that. Maybe it shouldn't be our goal to capture it in a single score. Maybe it should be our goal to better understand and explore the universe of possibilities and see how far a proposed plan is from the center of that distribution. That allows you to measure things in many different ways, and it doesn't have to degenerate into a hodgepodge or even worse, become gobbledygook, as some in the Supreme Court would have it. It can instead be a robust way to have a baseline that's specific to the laws and the political geography of each individual state. So lots of different metrics are being refined, are being discussed, are being debated, but along with all those metrics, I hope consensus is starting to crystallize around a way to take many things into account at once, and that's by understanding the universe of possibilities against which you're comparing a given plan.
Thank you. I love that the mathematician has proposed a populist, a democratic populist way of drawing maps. Every man a king, every person a map maker. So that was very helpful. Before we go on the courts, I wanted to turn to Wendy to ask how much, it does seem that there has been an increasing interest in this issue in state legislatures. Could you talk about if this isn't solved at the level of the court, what kind of proposals are floating around state legislatures to fix this problem?
Well, thank you. I'd be happy to address that because I think today it's looked a little bit like legislatures are standing in the way of reform. And in fact, there's a number of reform. Oh, and I got a little laugh over here from Ruth on that. Reform is absolutely coming forward from legislatures around the country. Ruth gave us sort of some reform around the legal side. We don't know what the outcome will be. And then Moon gave us the new thinking from the mathematical side. And legislators are pretty much thinking process. Process. What are things that they can pass laws on? And those kind of fall into three categories. The first is who's going to draw the commissions, which is mostly about, draw the maps, which is mostly about commissions. And then the second thing could be criteria, and we've heard some about that, and I hope we'll talk about that at some length later on. And then the third would be about transparency or public access. So I see that as that's the entire bouquet of things that legislators have in front of them. But each of those, of course, has a gazillion little subspecies underneath it. Just on the commission part, I do think that's getting the lion's share of attention. There have been bills this year in at least 28 states to shift to commissions. And if you think of 13 states already having them, that's a lot of interest. Now, the next thing that I'm pretty sure you're going to tell me, Michael, is that they're not going anywhere. And that's pretty much true. All of them have died. But I will say that there are two places to look at where they got fairly far. And Delaware, a state that's controlled by Democrats, had a commission bill come out of one of the chambers. It was introduced by a Democrat, so that was a majority member put his bill forward, and it got through that one chamber, and then the session was over. Maybe it'll come back again next year. And then in Nebraska, which is nonpartisan on its face, but it's the most Republican-leaning nonpartisan legislature we've got, they produced last year a a commission plan, and it was vetoed by the governor. So there is action on the commission side amongst legislatures. One other idea, and this one came to me, I think it was when Dean Fung was talking about weaponizing redistricting. Well, out of Maryland, there was a proposal that Maryland would, you might say, lay down its weapons if another matching state that tended to have a Republican majority would also lay down its arms. So arms race up, arms race potentially back down. And I'll stop there, hoping that we'll talk about those other things later, too.
And you opened it up for me. I wanted to ask Michael, are all commissions created equal, or if I may invoke or paraphrase a sacred phrase, why is one kind of commission better than another kind of commission?
So the answer to that, EJ, is not surprising. Not all commissions are, in fact, created equal. Some perform materially better in terms of how various stakeholders, whether it's lawmakers or citizens or communities of color, see the outcomes. And some remain very highly politicized processes. So, for example, it may come as no surprise that the Redistricting Commission in New Jersey, it leaves a lot of people unsatisfied, and it's very political. If you sort of imagine what a redistricting commission and redistricting process in New Jersey would be like, that's probably it. It's not a very transparent process. It takes place in a hotel suite, and the two parties sort of negotiate, and there's a neutral in the middle, and he sort of is the kingmaker. And people like Governor Christie come in and they meet. It's sort of, it is a very closed-door process. It doesn't have a lot of hearings. There are only 3 hearings that take place in all of New Jersey, one in the upper part, one in the middle, and one in the southern part of the state. And there's just really not a lot of transparency to the process. By contrast, a commission where you actually see a lot of satisfaction there's certainly other ways that you could structure this, so I don't want to say that this is the only way that you can do this, but a commission where you see a lot of satisfaction is that in California, and there are a number of hallmarks for California and other commissions that are successful and more independent. One of them is that they have a very independent selection process. So in California and Arizona, people who apply to be on the commission are screened for qualifications, screened for temperament, screened for conflicts. And the goal of that is to get people who can, not only don't have the conflicts, but who ultimately are going to be like a jury, right? They're going to be people who can be fair-minded and team players and reason together, right? We don't expect people to leave their partisanship at the door. When I go to testify in legislatures, and people always say, well, everybody's partisan. You can't take that out of there. And it's like, yeah, but you can get people who are going to be more fair-minded and play by the rules. And so the screening process is really important. In California, the screening process is particularly independent in that people apply, you have to write 5 essays, so it's like applying to Harvard. In fact, it may be more essays than you have to write to apply to Harvard. But then if you're selected, you go for a 90-minute interview before a panel of 3 auditors, which sounds painful, but it gets worse because it's actually broadcast on TV live. And so you go there, and people get to write in and say, oh, Dan applied. He's saying he's an independent. I know that he's married to like a Democrat, and she's like totally, I don't trust that. And so people would have a chance to put in input. And then there are 3 buckets created. And California is unique in the sense that it also has a large component of independence on the commission. Most older commissions have only Democrats and Republicans. California has 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents. The 3 buckets that are created, legislative leaders get to strike somebody off, but they don't actually get to pick. And then there's a random process that results in the commissioners. So the other thing that California does, and that I think is very important, is actually something that people don't oftentimes think about, and that's the size of the commission. California has a 14-member commission. If you have a smaller commission, not only do you not have room for demographic and geographic diversity, but it's easier to game the system, right? You get one person on there who's a rogue actor or decides on their own to be a rogue actor. That's a lot of weight. So a 14-member commission, if you mess up on one selection, it's not the end of the world. California and other commissions that have well-defined, prioritized criteria. As Moon alluded to, there are many things that we try to do in redistricting. Many state constitutions list a bunch of things. They are incompatible with one another. Like, districts are supposed to be compact, but they're also supposed to preserve communities of interest and do all kinds of things. And they're really sort of choices that you have to make. And the fact that they're not prioritized gives lawmakers or whoever draws the maps a lot of wiggle room. So having criteria that are set forth in stone and tell you which one is the most important, that's really key. And what we found is that if you have an independent selection process that goes along with that, the commissioners act very much like a jury, and they try to follow the rules, and they kind of like refer back to them. So those are some of the hallmarks of like really successful commissions. There are many ways that you could do this, but a lot of it is in the early design process. And if you just sort of get the right people in there, the maps that are much fairer. So California used to have a problem with high partisan bias in its maps. It now has greater competition. It has more compact districts. It has much more community-based districts. It has more minority districts, all out of a process that produced maps. And so the other thing I will add is like California has like huge transparency, and that's like big. So anyone can submit maps. All of the proceedings are broadcast on TV. They're archived to this day. You can watch the very first meeting on selection of commissioners to the very last vote on commissions. They held about 70 hearings around the state. And that sort of really sort of gave a lot of room for people to participate and feel like the process was not something that occurred behind closed doors. You actually can watch the hearings where they try to draw the California congressional map, and a lot of times like people were almost on the verge of tears, and you get to see all of that. It's quite dramatic, and maybe someday they'll make a mini-series or a musical out of that. So I'll stop there.
It's funny you said that. Anybody in the question period who wants to defend poor New Jersey should stand up, because when you talked about a miniseries and you were talking about Jersey, I thought of a Jersey Shore episode, Snooky Draws the Line. So can you imagine what that would look like?
Yeah. So the best story out of New Jersey is like Chris Christie would come to the New Jersey commission hearings, and the Democrats would win one room, the Republicans would win one room, and the neutral was in the other. They would sort of circle. They would each go to meet with the neutral. When Christie came to meet with the neutral, the Democrats would be in the hall, and they would play the Emperor's March from Star Wars as he came in with his entourage. So, I'm not saying New Jersey isn't a good commission necessarily, but it is a colorful commission. So.
Redistricting can be fun. Cathy, why are we talking so much about this in a way that we probably weren't 10 years ago? And our Republican friends might suspect that it's because Republicans control the process in so many key states, and therefore we see problems that we might not have seen before. A more neutral way of saying that is gerrymanders used to balance each other off better than they are now. Why do you think there is an engagement with this issue now in a way that I don't think we have seen in the same way?
Yeah, and it's EJ, I think you're absolutely right that this issue is, 10 years ago, if you threw a conference on redistricting, I don't think we'd have 200 people sitting here in a room.
Unless Miles organized it.
And you definitely wouldn't have the literally thousands of citizens who are out there talking to their neighbors about this right now. And so as people are, the increased frustration with our government not necessarily addressing some of our problems, the sense that you can't hold your elected officials accountable, all of these things are helping interest groups and ordinary citizens actually make the connection. So the sort of the lack of accountability and the extreme partisanship are driving some really unusual activities that are happening out there. So while there are all these bills that are happening in the legislature and not moving very much, there's actually a ton of stuff that's happening in states where citizens can take the matter into their own hands and go to the ballot. And so in Missouri, you have a set of citizens and groups that have come together to address both corruption and redistricting through a state ballot measure. And yeah, you get a bunch of the traditional institutional party players engaged in that process, but you're also getting Planned Parenthood who stepped up because they feel that the legislature isn't accountable around the issues that they care about. There's a citizen initiative that's happening in Ohio, and there are two kind of interesting people who are getting behind it. The first is the Ohio Environmental Council, because there's no competitive state legislative district in Ohio right now. So if there's no competition, there's no accountability. So if you're a grassroots organization, you can't leverage the power that you would have to be able to move your agenda. So they're getting behind this initiative. But so is the Manufacturers Association, because they're watching the legislature spend more time regulating whether or not you can create cakes for, gay weddings, or whether or not you can, defund the Planned Parenthoods, and they're not actually trying to figure out how to create a favorable business climate in Ohio for them. So they've actually weighed in on this. And you get community foundations who sort of see the gridlock that's happening in some of these state legislatures, and services at the basic services not actually being met because budgets aren't getting passed in state legislatures. And so they're feeling the need to say we really need to address that. But by far, what this has done is it's created citizens to do it. So there's a measure that's moving forward in Missouri. In Michigan, volunteers have collected more than 300,000 signatures and will likely qualify that measure before Thanksgiving. They've raised almost no money. It's literally just citizens out there training each other how to do this and moving forward to create an independent commission. You've got this measure moving forward in Ohio. You have citizens looking at putting measures on the ballot in Alaska, in Oklahoma, in North Dakota, in South Dakota. These are all places where you have citizens have the ability to move this issue on the ballot. And it's a precursor, I think, to, as we go forward, this demand that both Ruth talked about and Michael talked about, that there's the ability for citizens, limited capacity, to be able to influence redistricting, and that sitting back and letting this just happen behind closed doors probably isn't going to happen, but it's not going to be handed to citizens either, that they're going to need to get in and engage and organize and figure out how to hold their elected officials accountable as we go through this process. But I think they're geared up and ready to do it.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Dan, and then I want to just make sure everybody on the panel, including Ruth, feels free to jump in response to what's said. I think we can get everybody involved by going to Dan next, and then please feel free to respond. And you can constantly give us mathematical guidance, if you would. What's the best number one argument you hear for just keeping redistricting in the hands of elected officials? And if I may add to that, what's the best argument back?
Right. So this is a topic I wanted to get into because it's sort of cathartic for me. No matter how many times I hear these arguments, still get a vein in my forehead that pops out. So let me tell you what they are. I'll usually hear people defending legislatures' control over the process of saying that, for instance, alternative bodies like independent citizen commissions can't be held accountable to the voters. So that's one. And another one is that Michael sort of alluded to, that everyone has political views, so you might as well leave it in the hands of the legislature. You can't find some perfect body of unbiased citizens. To take these on sort of one at a time, the response to the accountability question. The way gerrymandering is done is that communities are sliced and diced using scientific precision, combining big data with voter information down to the household level to ensure that the likely partisan outcome of districts is predictable for basically the entire decade. So the idea that, basically the purpose of gerrymandering is to prevent accountability to the voters. So the notion that somehow voters can then hold these hold legislators accountable in these gerrymandered districts doesn't really make any sense. In addition, there are provisions for removing commissioners. In the independent commissions, if they don't do their job, they suddenly fall into one of the conflict of interest categories. So I think that doesn't make a lot of sense. The other notion, sort of the response to the idea that you might as well let legislators draw districts because you can't find unbiased people. Everybody has political views. I think of this as sort of like the Mary Poppins argument. I have a 4-year-old. I think it's a notion that if Mary Poppins isn't available to babysit my kid, I might as well hire a serial killer. Surely we can agree that there's a qualitative difference in a process in which Michael described, for instance, California with that kind of impressive screening process, ensuring that people don't have a personal stake in the outcome of the drawing of districts. That surely you're going to have better qualitative results than elected officials drawing their own districts, in sort of behind closed doors without any sort of scrutiny. So those are the arguments I deal with, and that made me feel good.
I just want to tell everybody that besides all the other good things you'll get out of this conference, it's the first conference where you ever heard Mary Poppins and a serial killer used in the same sentence. Wendy wanted to come in on something.
Well, Dan, I might want to say something at this point, thanks to your comments. And actually, going back to you, Cathy, I do want to say that legislatures have sent ballot measures to the voters on a number of occasions, and the New York Advisory Commission was sent there by the legislature and voted up in 2014. And then in Ohio in 2015, again, the legislature referred a measure to the citizens. So some of the measures that you get to see on the statewide ballots are legislatively driven, and some are driven by citizens. But I've been thinking about what the success of a plan is, and I do not know. We've heard that it should be that plans are fair, and that sounds good. But there's another thing that we've been looking at, and that's whether they pass court challenges. And this is something that researchers could be looking into in greater depth, but a good friend to NCSL, Peter Watson, has done a first-level cut on this for the last several decades, and the results from commissions fare about the same in courts as the results from legislatively drawn maps. So how do we know that the commissions are going to do a better job if that's the direction we want to go?
Ruth, I was hoping you'd want to come in.
Yes, just on that last point that Wendy made, I agree that there are many metrics of fairness. If partisan fairness or having low partisan symmetry scores is something that you care about, then there is evidence that if you let Democrats control the process, they advantage themselves, and if you let Republicans control the process, they advantage themselves. But if you have a commission or divided government or the courts draw the process, they tend to get pretty close to zero. So there is some good evidence that at least on that metric, you are able to do better than the legislators. My thinking is, when you said before that I laughed, I'm from Illinois, and so everyone in Illinois thinks I'm a huge Republican because I hang out with the Republicans to try to get redistricting reform, and all the Democrats hate me. I then go up to Wisconsin and represent the Democrats, and so, just all legislators seem to hate me. And I like that. I'm on the side of the voters. But yes, there are usually people that you can find on your side. There are legislators who will say to you in quiet corners, look, I think you're right, but I, can't get primaried at the next election, or I can't have this apparatus fall down around me. I mean, even when we had the amicus briefs that were coordinated brilliantly by Michael Lee and Dan Vicuña, there was an amicus brief from current congressional members, and there was tremendous pressure on the Republicans to not sign on to that because it wouldn't go. Obviously, it's going to mean that at least in the state legislature in Wisconsin, there are going to be less Republicans elected. And so many of the legislators themselves really do get into it for the right reasons and care about process. You just need to find a way that they can come together without having all of the money of their party thrown against them at the next election.
Could I ask you a follow-up on that? I live in Maryland, where also the Republicans are on this side. I mean, I live in a very gerrymandered district myself. Do you think the fact that quite a few Republicans have signed on to this will make any difference at all in the way the justices think about this case?
I don't like to predict Supreme Court outcomes. If I could do that, I'd be very rich. I hope that it matters that there are people of both parties who care about this. I recently was somebody sent a quote from the NDRC website, the Democratic Redistricting Committee website, that talked about how unfair 2014 was, and look how many people voted for Democrats, but look how many Republicans got elected. And it was almost word for word the same as a quote that Ronald Reagan had given in 1987, like literally 20 years ago, complaining about how the Democrats were doing all the gerrymandering. So I just hope we can get to a point where both sides care about it at the same time, to the point where we can get rid of it.
Michael wanted to come in. Can I piggyback a question after whatever it is you want to say, which is, and I'd invite anybody on the panel, depending on how this case goes, what effect do you think it's going to have on the future? In other words, what reform strategies flow from one outcome versus another outcome? But go ahead, say first what you wanted to say.
I want to follow up on Dan's comments about arguments that you hear against redistricting reform, and a lot of them are silly, as you know, Dan has trouble actually saying them without laughing. But but one that I think is serious, and you sort of have to think about when you structure a commission, and that we need to take very seriously, is whether this will give communities of color a real voice on the commission, right? And many communities of color have felt, you know, minority lawmakers oftentimes have a conflict of interest. They want like really super PAC districts, and you know, there are any number of reasons why they have sort of conflicts. But at the same time, they are really effective and zealous advocates of looking out after themselves, and in the course of doing that, they will look out after their communities if for no other reason than as sort of a byproduct. And there is concern that when you have a commission, that particularly a smaller commission, but you know, even with the larger commissions, that you end up with no minority representation, or you end up with minority representation which is nominal. In other words, you end up with an African American on the commission who doesn't actually understand the complexities of how African Americans exercise political power and effectively, right? They sort of look at maps and they say, oh, that looks good because it has a certain percentage of African Americans, or it looks nice or something like that, but they don't sort of actually understand the complexities of that, and that is a real concern, because you know, we review lots of proposals, and many times you know, they're not sort of well designed to sort of ensure that you know, a screening process that sort of looks at people and you know, is great, but you know, even then you have to sort of get the right people in the pipeline to apply. So if nobody applies, and in California a lot of people did apply, 30,000 people applied, but you know, the nonprofit organizations spent millions of dollars trying to encourage people to apply and to, you know, sort of help them with applications and things like that. If that doesn't happen, then there's sort of a real concern, and I don't think they should be taken lightly about whether communities of color actually have a meaningful and effective voice at the table. To answer, I'll be the first to answer EJ's question. I do think, like, if there's a win in Whitford, it helps make the case for reform, along with what happened yesterday in Virginia, right? So what Whitford does is it creates legal uncertainty about maps, the prospect that any map is subject to challenge. I don't think it's any map, but there's the prospect of that, which means that potentially you get into really invasive litigation about what lawmakers were thinking, what they were intending, depositions get taken, emails get opened, all kinds of things like that. At the same time, what happened yesterday in Virginia suggests that there's political risk. You know, Democrats didn't win, or have sort of a very small majority, and we'll see what happens depending on the recounts.
There are at least 4 seats under 200 votes.
Right, and so, but at the same time, Republicans have to worry, because the way that you do an extreme gerrymander of the sort that happens in Wisconsin is that you don't draw districts that your party wins by 80%. If you do that, you're using your voters very inefficiently. What you want to do is spread them out as much as possible so that you win as many seats as possible, but that's building a wall for a 100-year flood and not for a 200-year flood or a 500-year flood. And what you have to wonder, if you're a Republican right now, is whether 2018 and 2020 are more akin to like a 500-year or maybe even a 1,000-year flood, and all of those defenses get swamped away. So that creates political risk. Whitford potentially creates legal risk, and that, I think, helps change the conversation around reform, because nobody knows how this is going to play out.
Okay. Yeah, Cathy and Moon want to come in.
I think it also continues to empower a bunch of the citizens. In Georgia this last year, there was kind of an example that's slightly different but a little bit the same, which is that the Georgia state legislature was trying to do a mid-year redistricting, They wanted to strengthen some of the seats, Republican seats that, had become a little bit more competitive than they wanted. And a legislator was building a new house, and they wanted to draw the lines to include that new house. And
That's considerate of them.
yeah, and and so that this map got introduced, and the communities that were getting redrawn and gerrymandered were outraged, and a bunch of organizations and those individuals sort of fought back. And started lobbying, which again isn't a usual thing to happen in this. But at the same time, there was a well-timed press conference to threaten a lawsuit, in this case around racial gerrymandering, not partisan gerrymandering. And so suddenly the legislators are looking at, oh, not only am I getting all of this public blowback on what it is that we're trying to do, but now I might be heading into these years of legal fights around this. And we don't want that. And so they ended up pulling the bill and not moving it forward. And that was the first time people were able to stop a Georgia mid-decade redistricting. And so I think as we think about drawing the maps in 2021, where the process is mostly still going to be controlled by legislators and subject in most cases to the veto of a governor, that you're going to have a potentially different climate for people, that they're going to have to be balancing this. And so it may bring those outlier maps back in to more reasonable, even without having to do the lawsuit on it.
Yeah, Moon, you wanted to come in, and if I could do a subsidiary question to whatever you want to say. I was very impressed by your presentation, because I think you should form an organization called Mathematicians for Democracy, because what you really seem to be trying to do is to help people for whom gerrymandering is a completely abstract concept that has nothing to do with their lives, and make it clear that they can understand it and that it matters. I'd like you to sort of say what you were going to say, but I'd be curious about your hopes for what might be accomplished, because when you think about it, in the end, it's not as complicated as it looks, but people have to sort of say that and argue it and explain it.
Right. Actually, so what I did want to talk about was our intuitions of unfairness, and then our analysis and how those do and don't match up in some ways, so that really does speak to that. There's, as we keep hearing, there's a lot, people are getting very activated about gerrymandering right now. We heard a mention a little while ago of Brian Cannon's group, One Virginia 2021, which started out small, and then they were just overwhelmed with interest from Virginians who wanted to sign on to their effort, because there's just so much heat and light. There's just lots of public attention on this right now. That's great. It's helpful. It's definitely it's important to bring pressure, but it's also important to look. Some of the things that invite the most intuitive disgust aren't actually what's wrong necessarily. So that's an interesting tension to look at. I wanted to give a couple quick examples. In the state of Utah, for instance, there's a public submission process for maps where a website was set up. I think it was redistrictingutah.com, something like that. And everybody could make an account. They could submit a map for consideration for the Congress, for the legislature, and for the school board. And thousands of maps were submitted. They were considered as long as they met the criteria that were listed. And then in the end, the legislature adopted one of the school board maps and ignored the others. You may not be surprised to hear that that's how it played out. But what's interesting is it produced congressional maps that look pretty reasonable to the eye. And in fact, their compactness requirement was just measured that way, the eyeball test. They just threw out ugly maps and kept the ones they thought looked okay, and true story. And what that produced was a map that does look okay. But Utah has 4 seats in the House of Representatives, and the way the map works is that Salt Lake City, which is the most progressive place in Utah, is actually cut up all 4 ways. It touches all 4 congressional districts. And as a result, Democrats who get something like 33% of the vote are locked out of congressional representation. So that's not a naked eye kind of observation you can make. Just a second quick example of that. Here's a story that I love. Last weekend in Asheville, North Carolina, the League of Women Voters had, I think NPR called it a not-so-fun run. They had a gerrymandering 5K where people came and walked or ran the line that cuts down through Asheville, North Carolina. They put up maps of the course that showed some jaggedy lines and said, I wonder what's happening over here. I wonder what's happening over there. And so they're leveraging the intuition that the ugly-looking map, they're pointing at the unfairness there, and they're activating people that way. People are coming out, getting to know the lines, getting to be part of the process, and that's great. But actually, when you do a little more analysis, even if you kept Asheville completely together as a community of interest, as a traditional political boundary, then you'd get one competitive seat any way that you slice Asheville, anyway, with straight lines, jagged lines, no matter how you do it, that has the same effect of making 2 safe Republican seats. So they were doing something really helpful, which is raising public awareness, galvanizing people, and getting them together, maybe pointing the intuitive outrage at not quite the salient feature there. And what I want to get at, and this comes back to Michael's comment about a 100-year flood, what we can do is an analysis that gets past the eyeball test, that gets past funny-looking shapes must be bad, and that looks at how maps behave under a range of assumptions, and that's what you need to do to see whether a party has built itself a firewall, to see whether communities of color are getting an opportunity to elect a candidate of choice. So this is just a long-winded bid to say intuitive indignation is helpful right now, and analysis may uncover slightly different and harder to spot issues that are just as threatening to democracy.
In my youth, I covered a lot of reapportionments, and on the eyeball test, and I was giving one of the line drawers grief about his map, and he then compared it to Phil Burton's classic California map of the early 80s, and he said, at least all of my districts are connected by bridges. His are only connected by bodies of water. So this is an old problem. Before we're about to turn to the audience, I just wanted to ask Cathy or anyone else if they could link this argument, this cause, to other reform causes. I mean, what are the, how should we think about this? Because all of this really has a lot to do with democracy. Voter suppression is part of that. Universal registration is part of that. Campaign money can even be seen as part of that. Could you or anyone who wants to join that conversation talk about it? And we can set up, are we going to have mics passed around? We've got thank you. And I invite anyone to join in. But
Great.
Yeah, Cathy.
Thanks, Dionne. I'll take a first cut at it, but I'm sure other folks on the panel here have some comments as well. I mean, you're absolutely right. The democracy issues are all intertwined. I am also doing a little bit of work on the census, and I think you need to get counted. You need to be able to draw a line where you can get good representation. You need access to that ballot box, and you need to get out and vote. And you need to be sure that you're not overwhelmed by money in that whole process, and that those things are fundamentally connected. Sadly, legislation actually moves more siloed, right? And so particularly on the ballot measures that are moving out there, there's this, most states have a pretty strict single subject requirement, so you can't move a more robust democracy measure. That's actually not the case in Missouri, where it is a single subject, just requires to a single act in their constitution. And so they're moving a piece of legislation that deals with sort of limits on lobbying and the revolving door, additional things around campaign finance reform, and changing how their redistricting is. And there's and the non-redistricting aspects of that, in particular the money in politics and the anti-corruption, are the most popular things. And so it becomes, the conversation is very broad around just democracy. Other folks are looking at how do you pair up in what could be 2 different measures, the idea of moving redistricting and voter access, or a voter bill of rights, that sort of address some of those accountability, participation, how do citizens' voices get heard as a bundle.
Here, could I just throw 2 others on, which is a national debate on moving Election Day. We have Election Day because it coincided with they were trying to protect Market Day back in the 1840s. The other is the idea you shouldn't have to wait more than a half hour to vote, which seems fairly fundamental. Right. I just wanted to ask Wendy, and then I'll go to the audience. How do you see these linkages between redistricting and other democracy measures happening in legislatures?
I think Cathy was spot on with saying that there's usually a single subject rule, so whether it's a ballot measure in most places or it's legislation, so they move separately. But I did come up with a phrase that I liked a whole lot. My executive director didn't like it. It's called mechanics of democracy. That was my phrase to wrap this all up together. And with thank you. Let's see if we can move mechanics of democracy to represent a number of these things. And we do have legislators who are interested in various pieces of that mechanics. In addition to what's been mentioned already, let's throw in the nominating process. How do we get our candidates? Particularly that comes up, you won't be surprised, every 4 years. And then also how we count votes and proportional voting has been mentioned, but ranked choice voting is actually got its moment in the sunshine this year as well.
I love mechanics of democracy because it's an attack on deindustrialization.
Oh, that's what I meant when I invented that. Yeah, totally.
Who wants to ask the first question? The lady here, pardon me if I don't recognize you. Please, if you could state your name, that would be great.
Yes. My name is Burl Hartman, and I work with a group called Environmental Entrepreneurs. And my question is for whoever wants to take it. Suppose the court does rule in favor of limits on partisan gerrymandering. Won't we still have the same problem that was referred to in an earlier panel, that the only way to enforce it will be through court cases, and they're expensive, and they're lengthy, and they don't kind of work?
Yep. This is employment for Ruth. So.
Well, my hope is no. Litigation was always the thing we had to do in Wisconsin because you couldn't do ballot initiatives and get a commission. That doesn't exist in Wisconsin. So I don't know that my optimism can go this far, but I would love it if you set limits on partisan gerrymandering and then the gerrymanderers go, well, there's no fun in it now, we'll give it to a commission. And so we actually get more commissions. That would be great. Alternatively, though, I think if we can present pretty solid evidence in advance of the passing of a plan to say, hey, you're about to enact a gerrymander, remember how I successfully sued Wisconsin, I'm going to come and sue you too, how about you don't do it? That's my hope that we can avoid litigation in most places.
And I think echoing on that, I mean, it's like the equal population rules or any number of things that we've had added to our electoral canon. Over time, states sort of adapt their practices to that so that they don't get sued and they're not constantly in court. After one person, one vote, you had a decade of litigation about what that exactly meant, and then people kind of said, okay, we understand. So I think that there is a possibility, that, at least for extreme gerrymandering, that happens. And it's important to understand that gerrymandering isn't one thing. So we're talking about extreme gerrymandering that sort of has this, like, it's a really big outlier. Gerrymandering is like cancer. It is multiple diseases. They have different causes. They have different symptoms. They have different cures. So they're like drawing a district so your brother-in-law can win an election to Congress, or protecting an incumbent may not get picked up necessarily by the Whitford type cases. You may need other remedies for that, but at least this sort of extreme skews where you have like a 10-3 map in North Carolina, a 50-50 state, or a 13-5 map in Pennsylvania, again, a 50-50 state, at least those go away.
Thank you. Could I ask, who wants to ask not the next, but the following question? I'd like to have mics in people's hands. I've got you. Somebody else had a hand up over here, I thought. No? Go ahead. I just want to move the mic so we have two mics in hand so we can get more people in. Go ahead.
You want to stack up people waiting. Right. I'm Reg McKean, Brookline, and my question is, I guess based on the old adage about not having to reinvent the wheel too many times, surely there must be a model law of the ideal state legislation that would, in order to establish a redistricting commission that would meet all the wide, varied possible criteria, I hope. Is there such a law, and where can I Google it up quickly?
What a great question. You could tell he's from Brookline, one of the most reform-minded cities in the entire country. Who wants to?
I'll just start with, I think that, this is really an opportunity for states to be the laboratories of democracy that they were sort of intended to be. And so I don't know that there's really a one-size-fits-all. We have 20 staff state organizations, and we look to them to see, what's the right fit? Is it this full independent commission model? Is it sort of a balanced politician commission? The Iowa approach with nonpartisan state staff? So I think we look to our states to kind of tell us, what's politically feasible, what's the best fit for the culture of the state. So I think that's sort of a better approach.
Yeah, I could add to that, which is that when we were drawing up the ballot initiative in Illinois, I was like, well, California's great. Let's use that as an example. I said, so you need the independent state auditor. And the people in Illinois were like, well, we don't have an independent state auditor. Like, they're super partisan. So then we're like, oh, we have to find a fix around that. And so I think you can work out fixes for specific things that go on in different states. But you can certainly, borrow some things that seem to work well. As Dan says, the laboratories of democracy, you can use different pieces here and there, but ultimately to tailor something to the needs of the state.
So we're getting mechanics of democracy and laboratories of democracy.
So let me jump in for a moment. I want to say I absolutely agree. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all model law, but what we should be looking for is a model that has the properties. So this is sort of like maybe a meta principle here. We want something that has the property that gaming it makes you do better. Right? In other words, if we think, for instance, about this extreme outlier approach, if you want to make yourself safe from litigation, you're going to pull yourself a little bit in from the extremes, and you will thereby be doing better. Right? So I think that's something to keep in mind when we look at the different alternatives for scoring and adjudicating gerrymanders. We want them to be not gameable in the sense that an effort to avoid litigation will make you fairer and will make you perform better by our local and general conceptions of fairness.
Yeah, that's a great thought, and I want to speak up for our friend from Brookline, because it doesn't strike me as very satisfactory to say this varies locally. It's hard for me to think that it really, drawing district lines in Mississippi is really all that different from drawing district lines in Massachusetts. Maybe I'm missing something. Can somebody help me on that?
Yeah, well, the thing is that at the moment the rules are different. You could set up a single commission nationally, probably not constitutionally, but one could have the same, 6, 10, 14 people go in and draw lines in every state, but there would be different laws in each of those states that they would have to adhere to. So it's not that it can't be, the people in the process. It's every state has its own needs, and there are some idyllic principles that you can hope to achieve, right?
Let me sharpen the question. You can answer my first one and the second one at the same time. Just to sharpen the question, when all of you look at states out there, we have a lot of different models. What state seems to work best and most fairly? Is there such a place, or one or two such places? And Cathy, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think this is, I think it's more complicated actually than just there are different laws in every state, and there are different laws in every state, different constitutions in every state. And the states have different populations, right? We were talking earlier about how it's just easier in Iowa to draw square districts because it's a very homogeneous population, and there's not a whole lot of changes, and that's actually not true in a bunch of other places. But fairness is, we're throwing this around, but people come into this conversation having a different sense of fairness, right? Fairness for a grassroots organization could be competitive. Fairness for a civil rights organization could be more reflective democracy, where the population represents more of the actual population in the state. Fairness could be the ability to influence policy and to be engaged, or it could be what the process is, that incumbents aren't involved, right? So we have a different sense, depending upon your starting point, what actually equals fairness in this. I think we've talked about, and Wendy sort of labeled, there's the looking at who draws the lines and trying to minimize incumbent protection happening in the process. And so that's a model that's out there, right? And that could be an independent commission, or it could be a way to make the commission more accountable. Oh, and it's and then you have the criteria. What things are we using to draw the lines around? And that's both the compactness, but it's also the communities of interest, and how can we be sure that people have the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. And so those criteria, and that's a little bit state specific, but there are some good criteria that's out there that have been developed and are being used. And then I think the understated thing in this is the other thing that Wendy mentioned, which is the transparency and accountability. Then how are we setting the process up so it's not just happening behind closed doors and people don't know what's going on and we can't actually understand the intent.
Congress could be, we should mention that the states can fix this, but Congress also could fix it for congressional districts using its powers under the Elections Clause. And there are a number of bills. Senator Udall out of New Mexico has proposed a broad democracy reform bill that includes money in politics and redistricting reform. It's not going anywhere because, of course, Congress can't do anything right now, but it may in the future. And so we may get a debate nationally about what the best standards are and how much flexibility there is.
The gentleman over here, and then Archon, whose facial expressions during this discussion made me say, I can't wait to see what he wants to ask. Go ahead.
Thank you. Patrick Beatty. I'm a volunteer with an organization called Fair Districts Pennsylvania. And we have about 14,000 members, all volunteers. I myself am a volunteer part-time legislative director. Our goal is to create an independent commission. And I think I'd like to have a little bit of a reality check, and I can speak from my experience dealing with this issue in the Pennsylvania General Assembly, is that if you do not have the initiative in your state, and you're just trying to get the legislature to give up power that they have, that they certainly do not want to give up, it's extremely difficult. We have 14,000 members. Yesterday we had 500 volunteers at the polling places across the state, getting more volunteers, getting them to sign our petitions. But we are getting absolutely zero traction in the Republican-controlled legislature. So I guess, I mean, again, it's kind of a reality check that it's extremely difficult if you don't have the initiative. But then my question, which I'm finally getting to, is what can we do? What do you think that Republican-controlled legislatures will consider as some kind of reform, if not the creation of an independent commission? Is it transparency? What is it that they might engage with, if not to create an independent commission?
I'm grateful for your question because on my list, and I wanted to ask Wendy this, how many states have the possibility of doing this through initiative, and how many has it succeeded in?
There's 26 states that have the citizens initiative process, so 26 is the total number that could do it this way, and Arizona did it this way, California did it this way, Colorado did it this way. I can't list off ones earlier than 1990 for you that went this path. I will tell you, though, that South Dakota had it on their ballot in 2016, a citizens initiative, and it did get voted down there. So before that vote, I had been thinking when it gets onto the ballot, it's yes. We now have evidence that that's not the case. It was voted down in South Dakota, and actually one in Ohio was voted down a few years ago, too, and since has been changed. Can I respond to?
Yes, please.
So you asked what you can do if it's not going to a commission, and that brings me back to talking about criteria, because who draws the lines is one question, but what's the legal standard that they need to meet is another question, and that's true whether it's the legislature or the commission. Most of the commission bills that we're seeing do have a component relating to the criteria, but that does not, there are also bills that are separate from that where you can have new criteria without going to a commission. And the three that are coming up are competitiveness, which we had a conversation about earlier today, and also this idea of not favoring nor disfavoring a party or incumbent. That's related but not exactly the same, and I hope someone else can parse the difference. And then there's also suggestions that you prohibit the use of political data, which might draw a laugh from the people such as Kelly and Chris, who we heard from earlier. But those are efforts that can be handled separate from a commission, and maybe getting traction. I am seeing a little more interest, particularly in the competitiveness piece.
Florida did that.
Oh, yeah, Florida has that, and they did it through an initiative. Yeah.
I shouted out Miles. I should shout out Archon Fung for all the work he's done on this. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was just fascinated by the model law question and then the back and forth, because EJ's a journalist, and so he understands that people think in narratives and particulars, but the responses were all hugely resistant to providing particulars and narratives. And so people aren't going to mobilize around a redistricting reform agenda unless there are particulars and narratives. So I guess my question is, why not just say, well, you ought to look at California or Arizona or Colorado? Why the huge amount of resistance?
I think people do say you should look at those states. I mean, right? I mean, yeah. I think people say, like, if you were to ask us, like, what do you think? And we review these all the time. I mean, we say you should consider this, or you should. I mean, we get proposals where computers will draw the lines, right? You know, which terrible idea, right? I mean, it's sort of like, or that we should all do Iowa, right? And it's like, no, your state is really much more demographically complicated, right? So we get, you know, we in California is a big model because it is, California is the first redistricting commission that's been done in a large, demographically complicated states with multiple big cities, with lots of ethnic groups, not only like Latinos, there are probably like 16 different types of Latinos in Los Angeles, right? And so California is a big test, you know, and there's a lot to be done there, but we also know that you could also reform California, because we did a lot of interviews in California, and people say, like, well, I would do X, Y, Z better, right? And so it's a constant evolution, as Dan said, the laboratories of democracy. But to your point about mobilizing people around reform, once you develop a policy and once you go out there and start talking to people about it, they embrace it hugely. I mean, Michigan is a great example. There are volunteers out there. They've collected almost 370,000 signatures. I was in Ohio last week talking, and people were talking about how they went testifying before the Ohio legislature, which finally got shamed into having hearings on this, about how they would go door to door in their very mixed partisan neighborhood, Democrats living next door to Republicans, and every single person signed. People get this. This is not really actually that hard, but you do have to sort of develop the policy and make it right for your state.
I want to bring in Ruth and Moon. I just want to thank Archon. This is the first time in many years where somebody might use the word journalist as a positive, and I'm grateful for that.
So two things. The first one is that there is a document called Redistricting Principles for a More Perfect Union that Common Cause and others got behind and did. So there are principles. But when Arkansas calls me up and says, I'm interested in doing a commission, if I say, I've got this great idea from California, that's like the biggest way to sink what's going to happen next. So there are reasons not to say that as well.
Yeah, I guess I want to push back on the idea that there's no narrative emerging here. I just think that independent commissions are only a piece of the story. They're great, but they still have to draw the maps, and they still need guidelines. And so part of the conversation up here is about what those guidelines should be. I'm promoting, in my remarks, something that I think could be just as powerful of a slogan or principle as maybe one person, one vote was once upon a time, and that is when you get to draw the lines, you get a lot of control, but you don't get all the degrees of freedom. You cannot implement an extreme outlier. That's a narrative. That's a principle. It's flexible. It's customizable for different states. You want to look at the political geography. Mississippi is enormously different from Massachusetts, and the challenges there look different, and the degrees of freedom look different, and what you can do with a map looks different. But this, what I hope is a pretty rhetorically persuasive and flexible narrative emerging from this is an extreme outlier standard. You can put a thumb on the scale, but at some point you've gone too far. And that's something that I hope that we can crystallize around, and that could be helpful in bracketing the freedom even for commissions just as much as for legislatures.
Thank you. This gentleman, and then there's a gentleman back there, and then the gentleman up front, and okay. Who's got the mic? You go ahead.
Thanks. So thanks, Moon, for your comment 15 seconds ago. There is a huge difference between Massachusetts and Mississippi. By the way, my name is John Greenbaum. I'm the Chief Counsel at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and have done voting there and at DOJ for the last 20 years. Mississippi has a very robust history of discrimination. There is some history of discrimination in voting in Massachusetts, including a plan that was found to be intentionally discriminatory, and even when I was at DOJ, I did a case in Lawrence, Massachusetts on behalf of Latinos, but it in no way compares with the history of discrimination in Mississippi and how that is going to affect every aspect of the electoral process, including with respect to redistricting. So it really can't be one size fits all. And by the way, I think it was Chief Justice Roberts in the Shelby County case that made that comparison between Massachusetts and Mississippi. And frankly, I jumped out of my chair when I heard you say that about 15 minutes ago.
Can I don't even want to defend myself on that one, because as soon as you started talking, I realized I think Shelby County is one of the worst decisions ever rendered by the Supreme Court. And obviously, my point was not that there's no difference between Massachusetts and Mississippi, especially since I hail from Massachusetts. But I did think that, but I was trying to make the point, perhaps I should have said Massachusetts and another state, because I was pushing back against the idea that there can't be a model law. And I won't sing the old Phil Oakes song about Mississippi. Moon wanted to come in on that.
Well, I just wanted to give a little signal boost for the Lawyers Committee, and I think Ruth maybe also used to work with the Lawyers Committee. They're maybe not as well known as they should be, but I'd like everyone in this room to hear the name. It's a civil rights organization with central office in D.C. and local offices all over the country that's doing a lot of really hard work in the trenches, filing cases and paying attention to voting rights around the country. So just boost for LCCR.
Thank you. The gentleman over here.
Yeah, I was wondering, assuming that the Supreme Court rules against gerrymandering, how soon could we expect redistricting? That is to say, would it be immediate, or would it not be until after the 2020 census? And if in either case, on the principle that it's possible to chew gum and walk at the same time, or think at the same time, is it possible for Democratic strategists to attempt to make appeals against voting? The gerrymandering principle works because people vote against black people, black interests. An alternative appeal would be that to try and show that black and white working and middle-class interests can complement each other. And that would involve a kind of conceptual innovation, I suppose, that would be very useful and helpful to the Democrats. And it would overcome the gerrymandering strategy anyway, I think, although I may be wrong about that.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. So one of the things that we do with redistricting is we don't actually move any people, we move districts, and we don't change any votes, we change how they're aggregated. So in terms of who should be voting with who about what, that's not something that we do in the redistricting field. The question is, as long as people are voting in a certain way, what's a fair way for them to be represented? And to your question about the redistricting, all of the maps stand until they're struck down by a court, or until we have the census results released in 2021, where all of the states will then go through and redraw lines. So if we were to win, then there would presumably be a remedy phase in Wisconsin. There may be other states that currently have cases in the works, like North Carolina, Maryland, Pennsylvania. So they may get struck down before 2020. But otherwise, even if they get redrawn, right, Wisconsin could redraw its maps and then in 2021 have to redraw them again with the new census.
Thank you. Let's see, this gentleman over here, does somebody have a mic, or anybody have a mic in their hands right now? This gentleman. Oh, okay, you go first. You got a mic.
Yeah, hi, Carmen Siriani again. Following up on Archon's question about journalism, I just wonder, might there be some journalistic best practices for when we're reporting elections to also sort of overlay, or maybe preceding the reporting, overlay what are the sort of imbalances, the outliers, et cetera, because you get John King up there, boom, 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 and you pull, this is a such and such county, but we get no insight whatsoever as to how any of those districts are set up. And I don't know how hard that would be to do. I'm just wondering.
Could I say, since I'm a journalist, I think it would be fascinating on election night in every state when you're reporting legislative results to give voters a sense of what the overall popular vote is in a state so that voters at least could right on the spot notice how much out of line or not the outcome of the district by district races are with the outcome of the popular vote. In the Electoral College, we actually know that. And I think it would actually be useful, I'm glad you asked the question, for people routinely to report the popular vote for, for the National House and for state legislative seats.
I can't remember who said it because it was on my Twitter feed, but I think it was the New York Times, that in Virginia last night, House of Delegate candidates, the Democrat delegates received 9% more votes than Republicans, yet the House of Delegates itself is likely to be 50-50 once the election plays itself out. And so that's, again, an interesting figure then to sort of say, okay, well, this is how far those districts are skewed right now.
That may be inevitable. That may have to do with the political geography of the state, which is why you need some sort of analysis to unpack that. It may be impossible, given where people live, to draw lines that give you a proportional outcome.
Well, I think they tried real hard in Virginia to get that outcome. I think there are problems with packing of Democratic votes and all that, but most of these egregious gerrymanders go way beyond that. And even if it's true, it's still useful to have a number like that because it puts in people's heads the idea that there may be a problem that we have to explore.
And just since I'm on record, let me say, I do think reports of natural Democratic packing are overblown.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Who's got a mic at the moment? Yeah.
Hi. My name is John. I work for an environmental advocacy group just to show the breadth of groups that are organized and interested in this issue of gerrymandering, because we can't get environmental policy that we need and want if our legislators aren't responsive to the will of their voters. And so that's why organizations like mine, which is Friends of the Earth, I probably should have said that, are involved in these cases. I'm a little bit interested in hearing more about possible remedies, again, to activate your optimism. It's not enough to be optimistic. We have to have a plan if the day does go for us. And one of the problems I've encountered, I've been working a lot in North Carolina, where we have an illegitimate legislator who is elected through illegitimate maps, and that's not my own personal opinion, but the opinions of courts, now writing or drawing the new maps. So we have a bunch of heroin addicts dictating drug policy. Now, I actually wish we had heroin addicts doing that because I feel it would be better and more just than what we have in North Carolina. But so this idea that, oh, well, the courts will decide and then the states have to go through their processes, and not to shock people, we don't even have an agreed form of a ballot in this country, much less an agreed form of redistricting. So how can we expect the people of the legislator in North Carolina to fix a problem that they not only created but have repeatedly tried to get away with again and again and again, not to bore people with the details of the undemocratic techniques that they use?
I think that's why we're in court, but thank you for that. I think I see three. There's a gentleman up front here whom I did not notice, and is there somebody in the back with a mic? I'll bring in two more, and I'll let the panel close. Oh, okay. If people are very brief, you can all get your questions in, and then I'll ask the panel to respond, to close with whatever they want, at the risk of evading all your questions. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sam Hirsch. I'm with Jenner and Block, and based on a New York Times op-ed that I co-authored with Tom Mann, I wrote a piece quite a few years back for the American Mathematical Society called Proposal for Redistricting Reform, a Model State Constitutional Amendment. It actually contains boilerplate language that could be adjusted for each state, but it is based, and this is going to be ironic given what you heard from Michael, It's actually based on the successful part of the New Jersey Apportionment Commission, where
I knew somebody would speak up for New Jersey.
I'm going to speak up for New Jersey. The essence of what happened there, this is when Larry Bartels was the chair, a wonderful political science professor from Princeton, was that each party's delegation went back and forth on an iterative basis saying, here's our map, and then he would go to the other delegation and say, show me a better one. And he would get it and go back to the first party and say, show me a better one. And he kept ratcheting them up on criteria like partisan fairness, competitiveness, respect for political subdivision lines, and so forth. If you open up the New Jersey system, and I agree that the problem with it was lack of transparency and openness, if you open it up to the public in this era of the internet, what I'm describing is what happened 20 years ago. If you open it now and say, members of the public can submit maps, and if you don't have a map that's as good or better on each of these criteria as the current reigning champ, we're not even going to look at it. But if you can show a map that's got as few political subdivision splits, as many competitive districts, and is even more unbiased as between the two parties, then that will be the temporary reigning champ, and then we'll ask the public to throw a better map on the table. And you get better and better and better. You do this for a month or two, and you're done. You have a beautiful map with compact districts, near perfect partisan symmetry, a lot of competition, meets all the federal requirements, and so on and so forth. That's the basic idea, I think, behind the best redistricting reform. And it's not so much about who's doing it, but as Wendy says, it's really about the criteria.
I think I can't add anybody else to the queue. Or does somebody have a way to ask a question very briefly, because we are right at the time here?
Okay, I'll just go straight to the question. So I wanted to bring up, go back to comment that Michael made about actual...
Talk in the mic, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Actual or potential tension between the interests in controlling for incumbency protection and extreme partisan manipulation, and the other interests of historically marginalized communities wanting to have a opportunity to elect representatives of their choice. And I have heard some concerns from one leading organizations about the narrative goes along the lines of, once we finally reach some level of power in the legislature on behalf of, and can exercise it on behalf of our community, the rules are going to be changed. So actual or potential conflict between those two important interests, and if it exists or could exist, what do we do about it?
And one of the organizers, or last comment, real quick. I missed you entirely earlier.
It's all right. This is a question for the lawyers, and it may seem technical, but I think it's germane. Is the mic on?
Just talking to it.
Just hold it close.
Okay. It's prompted by the person from Pennsylvania. Did the Supreme Court decision saying that the Arizona Commission was okay, that legislature included the people, okay, part of that was based on the presence of an initiative process in Arizona. Does that mean that it's possible that the court could strike down commissions in states that do not have initiative?
So, all right, everybody who wants to say anything about any of these questions, please speak up. Thank you.
So
Thank you for all those good questions.
So I will address briefly the question about minority communities, and that's a very real tension, and it's a debate that people have to have, because we've heard a lot here today, people talking about competition, and that's great, but when people of color oftentimes hear competition, they hear that as code for let's take the black and brown people and drop them into white districts so we can elect more white Democrats, right? And that's real. I mean, and people, some people will say like, gosh, you're better off with a white Democrat than having all these Republicans, and that's an argument. But on the other hand, some people feel like white Democrats, particularly if they're more conservative, don't represent communities of color well. To Sam's point about New Jersey can work if you have the right neutral. The problem is that New Jersey system places a lot of power in the hands of the neutral, and if the neutral has his or her own agenda, then people it becomes a winner-take-all system. So in the past, it has worked well. In this most recent decade, we found in interviews that people were very dissatisfied if they were on the losing end.
Anyone else want to close with a comment?
Okay, my closing comment is just that these are the three questions I get the most. What is it that Iowa's doing that we aren't doing yet? Do commissions do it better than we do it? And the third one is, tell me how this works, because I wasn't here paying attention in 2010. So just know that that's what I'm being asked.
Ruth, Ruth, you open so you can close.
Thank you, yes. I guess I would say whether we win or lose or draw, in this case, there are always ways to make reforms. I've only been working in this voting rights area for about 10 years. There are people in this room who've been working for much, much longer. And so, as I continually say to our supporters and plaintiffs and so on, there are multiple ways to get to the end. And it seems as though from a great panel like this, there are so many ways through organising and communications and activism and litigation that we can hopefully get to a better place. And math. Mostly
and
math.
I just want to say, but one of my favorite lines about politics comes from the late Molly Ivins, who once said that if you took all the fools out of the Texas legislature, it would no longer be a representative body. And I do not think that we can guarantee a fair representation of fools, but we can have a less foolish way of drawing our district lines. And so I want to thank this great panel for seeking better systems for Massachusetts, Mississippi, and everywhere else. Bless you all. Thank you.